Okay, we're, of course, in the middle of our study of Christian evidences, and if you have your outline with you, this particular section that we're in is on the screen, but we're on the bottom of page 4 of your outline, where we're talking about, and really all of these, when we began this discussion really in Roman numeral 8 about Genesis 1 through 11 being literal and historical, and then we talked about flood. We'll continue this discussion through the next point, dinosaurs. But all of this really revolves around the age of the earth, and it's the very crux of the matter. And you either believe the uniformitarian evolutionary idea that the universe and the earth are billions of years old and man's been here for millions, or as we've been studying, if you believe the Bible and the Word of God, then you understand the earth is only a few thousand years old, anywhere from 6 and more than 10 max. And so we've been talking about various things connected to that, and now we're on this Roman numeral 10, the geologic timetable and age of the earth. And what we've been looking at is, so many times you hear about different dating methods that supposedly point to an old earth, and those have flaws, and that's not what we're looking at right now. What we're looking at is dating methods that point to a young earth. And so C1 there, paleontology, archaeology, we talked about out-of-place fossils. We talked about polystrate fossils, that is, those that cut through several layers of supposed time periods that have been laid down over all these gazillion of years. And then, as I mentioned before, we're not going to go through all of these. Some of these are somewhat, you got to really think about them, and you might want to look at them on your own. We're going to kind of hit some high points. I'm going to skip DNA and ancient bacteria. But look at D there, human population. I mean, this is a pretty easy to understand and obvious problem for an old earth believer. Because according to evolutionists, people have been around, I say people, that is, in our somewhat current form, not in our evolutionary, as Brother Cage used to say, knuckle walker form, 2 to 3 million years. And so you can arrive at how many people would be predicted to be on the earth at different points in history. Now, then you can even, statisticians can even account for war, disease, famine, and so forth. But if you assume that people have been around for 1 million, let's just use 1 million as the mark, rather than 2 or 3 million. There would be 10 to the 2,000 people on the planet today. Do you understand this number? Remember in math, you had so many to a certain power. What does that mean if I say 10 to the 2,000? That means I multiply 10 2,000 times. Okay, so if I do that, then what I find out is there's not even 10 to the 10th power of people on earth today, right now. So there should be 10 to the 2,000. So here's the deal. If 3 feet tall humans with narrow shoulders, 3 feet tall humans with narrow shoulders, were squeezed into the universe like sardines, there would only be 10 to the 82nd power of people in the universe. And yet, simple math would tell you if people have been around for 1 million years, there ought to be enough to fill almost 10 to the 2,000th universes of people. That doesn't seem possible, and it's not possible. But if you do the numbers, and let's say you use a date for the flood. Now this could vary as we talked about. But let's say the flood happened 4,350 years ago, and the planet was then repopulated by 6 people. That's Noah's sons and their wives. You should have between 6.7 and 8.1 billion people on the earth today. Well, how many people are on the earth today?
7 billion.
About 7.5 billion, in between 6.7 and 8.1 billion. So the math works out for a young earth. So human population statistics. We're going to skip carbon-14. You can read about that in Ancient Fossils and Materials, but I thought this was kind of interesting. Soft tissue or blood vessels in dinosaur fossils. And I've read about this in the paper in recent years. But supposedly dinosaurs lived when? From what period of time? How long ago? Yeah, about 250 million years ago until when? When did they supposedly die? According to the evolutionists. Well, I'm talking about time. How many millions of years ago? About 65 million years ago. So they lived from about 250 million years ago to 65 million years ago. And if man's only been here, according to them, 2 to 3 million years, then obviously they didn't cross paths. You know, no, men did not see dinosaurs. Okay? And we'll talk about that later as well. But it's obvious that no flesh could survive 100,000 years without decay, much less 1 million years, much less 65 million years, or 200 million years. But as of 2005, many dinosaur fossils have been cracked open, studied, and what did they find? Living tissue, right? Collagen, blood vessels, red blood cells intact, original proteins, soft and stretchy, flexible tissue. They found that in several dinosaurs. Well, you might could preserve in sterile conditions that kind of stuff for maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of years, not 65 million. And these dinosaur bones were found in the American Midwest. So what does that tell me? They're not that old. Number, let's see, G there, number 1, talks about human-dinosaur coexistence, and we're going to talk about that in more detail, so we'll skip that. But as I said, according to the evolutionists, dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago. We came on the scene 2 or 3 million years ago. There's 60 million years between us, and yet we're going to look at some evidence of human and dinosaur coexistence when we get to that point. Number 2, here's some examples from geology. Let's see. Danny, you have next slide. We're going to skip tightly folded rock strata and rapid, slow processes. Tightly folded rock strata means talking about finding rock that's actually bent. And that's kind of an interesting thing. But look down at number C under that, 2C. I thought this was kind of interesting, the amount of salt in the sea. Now, ocean water is salty, right? You've been in the ocean, open your mouth, sip the water. Each year, hundreds of millions of tons of sodium are added to the oceans, and only about 27% of it is removed by other processes, leaving an annual accumulation of 336 million tons of sodium. Now, if you start with a 0 sodium content in the sea and use the old Earth assumption of uniformitarianism, the current concentration of sodium in the ocean would be reached in only 42 million years. Now, how long has the Earth supposed to have been here? 4 to 5 billion years, right? So that's not possible. The U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration says that the ocean is 3.8 billion years old. But according to the sodium content, it can't be older than 42 million. Well, obviously the accumulation and dissemination rates have changed in the past, and here's the thing. Somebody says, well, how does that help you? 42 million years is still not a few thousand. Well, first of all, it tells me that the Earth, they're way off. But it also falsifies what view? What does it falsify? Because if they say, well, the accumulation and dissemination rates are not the same as they've always been, then what have they given up? Their theory, their doctrine of what? What have they given up? We're known as catastrophists. We believe the earth looks the way it is and is the way it is because because of a catastrophic event. In which time we would argue that all of these different rates, decay rates, accumulation rates, all those things would have been sped up and slowed down depending upon what was going on with the water and then the ice age that occurred shortly thereafter. They're known as what? What's the number one thing behind evolutionary theory? Uniformitarianism. The present is the key to the past. Everything goes on at the same rate, the same way it always has. So, they could say, well, obviously things aren't going the same as they always have. Then you've given up your theory. If you admit that this is not possible, you've given up uniformitarianism. It doesn't matter how big the difference is. 42 million to 3.8 billion is a big deal. Number 11 is pretty interesting. It's similar. I say number 11 in here. It's deep. Sediment on the seafloor. As water and wind scour the continents, 20 billion tons of material is deposited in the ocean. That's an estimate every year. 20 billion tons of material is swept into the ocean. As the tectonic plates of the earth move, subduction occurs with one plate slowly diving under another towards the mantle. You've studied this. So 1 billion tons of material is estimated to be removed from the seafloor each year from that process. So 20 billion tons is being dumped. 1 billion is being removed. What does that leave me? It leaves me 19 billion tons of sediment accumulating on the ocean floor every year. The average thickness of the sediment on the ocean floor is 1,500 feet. In other words, when you get to the bottom of the ocean, you're not really at the bottom. You're not to the rock bottom. You're just at the 1,500 foot sediment mark. Okay? Based on the current rate of sediment deposition, if you're a uniformitarianism, if that's your belief, the sediment on the ocean floor would accumulate probably in 19 million years. But the ocean is supposed to be how old? 3.8 billion. According to the National Oceanic Institute, it's 3.8 billion years old, but to get 1,500 feet of sediment on the floor, that would only take 19 million years at the current rate. So it doesn't support a billion-year-old ocean. And again, somebody says, well, it doesn't support 10,000 years. It does when you take into consideration there would have been accelerated erosion rates when what happened? Flood came. We're going to skip the next 4. Lack of erosion evidence between strata, helium and zircon crystals, orphan radio holes, classic dikes. I find these last 3 kind of interesting. They're just things that we're familiar with. And you don't have to be a scientist to understand this. How many of you in here have been to Niagara Falls? Yeah, a lot of you. It's a fabulous place to visit. It's pretty impressive. You know, it's located on the border of New York State and Ontario, Canada. It's about a 90-mile drive to Toronto from there. You can actually see Toronto across the lake, but that'd be a short drive if they had a bridge. But you got to go take the interstate around the water. Erosion has been slowly pushing the waterfall about 7 miles upstream, forming the Niagara Gorge. Before large water diversion projects were built in the 50s and 60s, the falls were receding at a rate of more than 3 feet per year. That's quite a bit. I mean, you've been moving 3 feet a year. If the Earth were 4.6 billion years old, and the falls had been eroding at 3 feet per year, the original location of the waterfall would have been 13.5 billion feet upstream. Now, keep in mind the circumference of the Earth is 132 million feet. So, yeah, I guess it'd been on Mars or something. It doesn't work out. The math doesn't work. If you're a uniformitarian. And if you're a uniformitarian, everything goes on. Please understand how important this is. Everything goes on the way it always has. Not a flood, not anything to speed the processes up or slow the processes down. I like this one, Mississippi River. We're all familiar with that. It runs right by here. And as you know, all rivers do, they pick up dirt and sediment from the riverbank. And approximately 300 million cubic yards of sediment are deposited into the Gulf of Mexico by the Mississippi River each year. So, if the Earth was 4.5 billion years old, there wouldn't be a Gulf of Mexico. It had been filled in a long time ago. And you got to love this quote from Mark Twain, who commented on this in his classic work, Life on the Mississippi, in 1883. You've probably heard of this. Here's what Mark Twain said about this. In the space of 176 years, the lower Mississippi has shortened itself 242 miles. That is an average of a trifle over a mile and a third per year. Therefore, any calm person who is not blind or idiotic can see that in the old Ulitic Silurian period, just 1 million years ago next November, the lower Mississippi was upwards of 1,300,000 miles long and stuck out over the Gulf of Mexico like a fishing pole. And by the same token, any person can see that 742 years from now, the lower Mississippi will only be 1.75 miles long. And Cairo, Illinois, and New Orleans will have joined their streets together and be plodding comfortably along under a single mayor and a mutual board of aldermen. There is something fascinating about science. One gets such a wholesale returns of conjecture out of such a trifling investment of fact. That was Mark Twain's twist on it. So Cairo and New Orleans will be right next door to each other. And how are we told, some of you, who all's been to the Grand Canyon? A lot of people have. You go out to the Grand Canyon, you get a little tour, what do they tell you? How was the Grand Canyon formed? How was the Grand Canyon formed? It was cut by what? By the little bitty Colorado River. Cut that big canyon. Over a long period of time. The problem, of course, is if that's what happened, there are over 900 cubic miles of dirt missing from the end of the river. Where'd that go? We know where the canyon wasn't cut by the Colorado. The canyon was made like just about any formation in the world was made today. And that was by the universal global flood of Noah. All right, next slide, Danny. Let's finish up our discussion of, these are some pretty interesting ones too, under the title of Astronomy, Astrophysics, and Geophysics. Now, go back. Maybe it was on there and I didn't see it. Oh yeah, it was. It's at the bottom, I'm sorry. Just small. Kind of hard to read. Oh, y'all can read it, good. Faint young sun paradox. I thought this one was kind of interesting. As hydrogen in the sun fuses into helium, the sun gradually increases in temperature. So you can calculate that at current rates, and remember that's all we got to go with if we're a uniformitarian is current rates. 3.5 billion years ago, supposedly the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. 3.5 billion years ago, the sun would have been 25% dimmer, dropping Earth's temperature some 31 degrees Fahrenheit. And so the whole Earth would have been below freezing. But according to evolutionists, the Earth in the beginning was not freezing, but it was what? When it was forming. What? Yeah, it was hot. Yeah, it was hot. It was, it was molten, right? It was hotter, not colder. And it was cooling, not heating up. So the problem would be without liquid water, 3 to 4 billion years ago, how would life ever emerge? I like this one too. Rapid decay rate of Earth's magnetic field. This one I've been around for a while. But you know, scientists have been measuring the strength of the Earth's magnetic field with pretty precisely since 1835. It is decaying at an exponential rate with a half-life of roughly 1,100 years. So if you follow that back in history, doubling the Earth's magnetic field intensity every 1,100 years, you reach a point 30,000 years ago when the Earth's magnetic field would have the strength of a neutron star, which would have created immense heat that would have prohibited life from existing and probably compromised the internal structure of the Earth. So just 30,000 years ago, the magnetic field would have been like a neutron star. You wouldn't have any life. That's 30,000 years ago. I love this one. Lunar recession rate. Did you know the moon is moving away from the Earth right now at a rate of 4 centimeters per year? How big is a centimeter? I don't know, 4 centimeters is about like that, right? The Earth is getting further away from us about like this each year. And as it gets farther from the Earth, it recedes slower. So if you do the math, which they can do, scientists can calculate where the moon would have been back earlier in Earth's history. So for example, 6,000 years ago, the moon would have been 750 feet closer to the Earth than it is now, resulting in little or no effect on the Earth, 750 feet closer. But if the moon, like the Earth, is 4.5 billion years old, did you know that 1.5 billion years ago, the moon would have been touching the Earth? Now that's a problem. So it's impossible for the moon to be older than 1.55 billion years old. And so, what do you do with that? Well, the evolutionist has to say, well, that the present recession rates obviously have not always been the same. Well, then what if they have given up? They have to give up their doctrine of uniformitarianism. Let's see if there's any others. Now that's pretty interesting. Yeah, let's go to that one. These others are kind of technical. The comet contradiction. Well, everybody knows what a comet is, right? Our solar system has thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of objects orbiting the sun. It's just not 9 planets and their moons. And over 3,000 of these objects are comets. Comets are balls of ice and dirt, and they move in elliptical orbits around the sun. Now, scientists believe that these comets are leftovers from the material that initially formed the solar system. Well, when was the solar system formed? What have we been saying? 4.6 billion years ago. See, the universe is supposedly 13 billion years ago, and our solar system is supposedly 4.6. So the Earth's been 4.6 billion years. As comets move close to the sun, solar winds and radiation from the sun blow material from the comet, creating the tail that we observe. Since material is removed from a comet with each cycle around the sun, obviously at some point in time, what's going to happen to the comet? Yeah, it's going to disintegrate. Be no comet. The typical lifespan of a comet is, wait for it, 10,000 years. So, supposedly we have a solar system that's been around for 4.6 billion years, and these comets were left over. But every time they go around the sun, they lose material, and they live only to be 10,000 years. Something's not jiving, right? Now, scientists speculate, as the evolutionist is good at doing, that there is a source of new comets outside our solar system. In other words, we're getting new comets from somewhere else, but they have no observational evidence for that. In other words, that's just their guess, their hope, their wish, because they know that, hey, these comets only have a life of 10,000 years. We think they're leftovers from the beginning of the solar system. Therefore, we'll postulate, we'll theorize that new comets are coming from somewhere else. Although, we've never observed that. We've seen that, but that's our theory. So,
That's a story we will stick to.
that's right. That's their story, and they're sticking to it. So those are just some representative samples. The point is, you will hear over and over again in the papers, about carbon-14 dating. We're not going to go into the flaws of evolutionary dating, but you'll usually hear about 3 or 4 dating methods that supposedly support their theory of a very old Earth. But nobody ever talks about 20 or 30 or 40. I mean, this is just kind of a sample of the things you can look at and say, hey, that's not possible. Earth cannot be that old, based on these various dating methods. All right, any questions or comments? Kind of technical scientifically, but we're going to get out of that here pretty soon. Let's move to Roman numeral 11, I think. Dinosaurs, science, and the Bible. Again, that's part of this tension between how old is the Earth, how long has it been here. Keep in mind when I said earlier that we were assuming the flood happened 4,350 years ago. Again, there is a limit. The Earth cannot be over 10,000 years old. If you look at the genealogies, now the genealogies in Genesis chapter 11 are worded differently than the genealogies in Genesis chapter 5. So keep in mind that genealogies in the Bible do not always mean that God is listing the firstborn son first. He may list who first in a genealogy. Yeah, the son, the person who is the most important son, which is generally the one in the Messianic seed line. So, if that's the case, then when you're trying to use the genealogies to count time from Shem to Nahor, Haran, and Abraham, there's some flexibility there, because if you're listing sons that aren't the firstborn, then we don't know how long of time there was between the firstborn and the one that's listed first. You follow what I'm saying? So, that being the case, all we can do is say if the firstborn were listed in Genesis 11, then that time frame is only about 400 years and the earth is about 6,000 years old. If it's not the firstborn, then all you can say is, well, look, we know that the oldest people that ever lived were about how old? 900 years. So if we use that as a maximum lifespan, then we can say that during that time frame, you could max out at about a little over 4,000 years. So you're looking at a frame that could stretch anywhere from 400 years to over 4,000 years. That's why I say the earth cannot be any older than 10,000 years old. And it could be anywhere in between, frankly. Maybe it's 7. Maybe the flood didn't happen in 4,350 years ago. Maybe it happened 5,000 years ago. Occasionally you'll see, they'll come out and say, well, this civilization, the pyramids were built 4000 AD. They could be wrong, based on some of the things we talked about, dating methods. But they could be right. But I know that pyramids weren't built till when? Till after the flood. It had been wiped out by the flood. So, but still, there's plenty of time for pyramid building. Whether the earth is somewhere between 6 and 10,000 years old. So, that means that dinosaurs didn't live 65 million years ago, or 250 million years ago. Question, did dinosaurs really exist? That's A under your outline. Did dinosaurs exist? Yes or no? True or false? Absolutely. Don't ever get baited into that. Sometimes I've heard over the years religious people say, well, no, I don't think dinosaurs existed. I think God just put those bones in the ground to fool people. What? God put a bunch of bones in the ground to fool people? No. So don't ever say something goofy like that. But everybody's intrigued by dinosaurs. Who wouldn't be intrigued by a 3.5-story, 100-ton lizard? That's intriguing, right? Kids love them. Adults love them. Look how much these movies make. Jurassic World, Jurassic Park 2, Jurassic Park 3, Jurassic World 1, 2, and 3. That tells me people like dinosaurs. And that's why this subject's important, because dinosaurs are the #1 poster child of evolution. They use them in kids' books. They fill them in all kinds of books and posters and textbooks. And in fact, some of the most famous evolutionists have said that they got their start on the road to being evolutionists because of dinosaurs at a very young age. What have the kids always told? These dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago. Men didn't live with dinosaurs. And if they did, they couldn't act because dinosaurs would have eaten them. Well, it would seem to me before the flood, the dinosaurs were like everybody else, which was what? They were vegetarians, more than likely. But, don't get ahead of me. Can you not see the outline?
Oh, yeah, there you go.
Mark's still learning to read. Okay. Don't do that. That's dangerous. Jump around in your own mind. Dinosaur bones have been found on all 7 continents. First ones were discovered in 1822 by a country doctor in England. And by 1842, they had found enough of them to convince the leading British anatomist, Sir Richard Owen of the British Museum of Natural History, that a whole tribe of huge lizard-like reptiles had lived in the past, and he named them dinosaurs from the Greek, which he translated as fearfully great lizards, but generally we say that that term means terrible lizards. Whatever. But of course, some of the biggest dinosaur finds have been found in the American West. And so it's not a question of did they exist, but the question is when did they live? And 65 million years ago or a few thousand years ago? Well, what does Exodus 20 verse 11 say? Keep going back to that. Yeah, go over there for a minute. BJ pointed out something too when we were talking about Exodus chapter 20. We talk about context. Remember we were talking in Genesis chapter 1. We looked at all those reasons why the word for day, when we were talking about theistic evolution, and we were talking about all those linguistic reasons, the Hebrew word for day, there has to mean a literal 24-hour day. And of course we mentioned context. But notice the context of Exodus chapter 20. Again, it's not contained in Genesis chapter 1 through 11, if you believe those to be myth, or poetic, not literal. Nobody argues about Exodus. Go back up to verse 8. Remember the Sabbath what? Day. Well, how long was that day to those people? How long was the Sabbath day? 24-hour period. 6 days you shall labor. Well, 6 eons of time I'm going to labor, and then I'm going to rest for one big long eon of time. No. 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. You'll do no work. Verse 11. For in 6 days, those same kind of days, the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and what? All that is in them, and rested the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So, Genesis chapter 2 verse 1 says his work, his creative work was finished. That tells me that dinosaurs were created on in the first week. Specifically what day? 6th day, right? Land animals. So, there's no question that dinosaurs and men lived as contemporaries on earth. Go back to Mark chapter 10. What did we say? We've looked at this before. Mark chapter 10. Jesus said, but from the what? Beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. Dinosaurs were here. Men were here. Go to Romans 1:20, as we've pointed out, from the very beginning, for since the creation, all of these things have been, what? Perceived. So somebody's been here doing the perceiving from the very beginning. 1 Corinthians 15 talks about Adam being the first man and so forth. And so dinosaurs and humans had to have lived together. So let's make Marv happy. Let's go over to Job chapter 40. So the question we ask ourselves, does the Bible talk about dinosaurs? Absolutely. Let's look at Job chapter 40. Well, not too far. Okay. All right. Look down about verse 15. Look now at the behemoth, which I made along with you. He eats grass like an ox. See now, his strength is in his hips. His power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar, a tree trunk. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. His bones are like beams of bronze. His ribs like bars of iron. He is the first or chief in the ways of God. Only he who made him can bring near his sword. Surely the mountains yield food for him, and all the beasts of the field play there. He lies under the lotus trees in a covert of reeds in the marsh. The lotus trees cover him with their shade. The willows by the brooks surround him. Indeed, the river may rage, yet he is not disturbed. He is confident, though the Jordan gushes into his mouth, though he takes it in his eyes, or when it pierces his nose with a snare. Now, a lot of your Bibles, if you go to the margin, it's going to tell you that this animal is most likely a what? What do they think this animal is in the commentator? What do they put in your margin? Huh? Yeah, it's a hippopotamus. Really? You ever seen a hippopotamus tail? You ever seen a hippopotamus tail? But if you go to books that describe the largest dinosaurs, like we used to call them when I was growing up, a brontosaurus. That apparently was a misnomer. Diplodocus or Argentinosaurus. One of those kind that, has the big body and the big tail and the long neck. Where do they usually depict them as living? Swamps. What would water do for an animal of that size? Got that long neck anyway, he's not
That's the
going
one
to
Fred
drown.
Flintstone go down here.
Yeah, it's the one Fred Flintstone. Slide down. What would water do for now? What does water do for you when you're in the car? It helps, it gives you buoyancy, doesn't it?
Oh, boy.
That's a lot of weight to carry around, but he's in the water. Water doesn't bother him. He weighs 100 tons, and he uses that long neck to eat what, he says? Lotus trees, the willows. He can reach all this stuff and snack all day. It's a dinosaur. It's not a hippopotamus. Turn over to, well, we're out of time. We're going to look at about 3 other chapters, a couple other chapters in the book of Job. Keep this in mind, too. This is something to think about. There's some good articles on the Apology Express website about this. But have you ever wondered where, think about this for next week. Have you ever wondered where dragon legends come from? All cultures have dragon legends. What were dragons? What kind of animal, beast were they? Were they mammals? No, they were what? They were reptiles. They were serpents. With wings and tails. And some of them could even snort fire. The Bible talks about an animal that can snort fire. There are bugs that can snort fire, by the way. It's chemical. I think it goes out the back. Do what? We'll talk about that next week. All right, pick up there.